Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's Family Justice Council seminar, Adoption in the 21st Century. Before we start, just a few points of housekeeping. First of all, can I ask you all to put your microphones onto mute and to turn your cameras off for the entire event? It's being video recorded, and the recording will be placed on the FJC website. You're welcome to tweet about the event using the hashtag FJC events. If you have questions, please put them up on the side chat bar, or you can like any questions posed by others, because the chat bar will be monitored and a few selected questions put on to the panelists, asked of the panelists at the end. As you will know, this seminar is one of a series taking place all this week, culminating in the Bridget Lindley Lecture, which is being given by Baroness Hale of Richmond on Thursday, looking at the way in which our notion of the family has changed in the last 3 decades. The seminar was supposed to have taken place in Bristol in March 2020 and has been cancelled twice because of the pandemic. So the FJC is extremely pleased to be hosting this event online and is very grateful to the speakers and all of you for supporting it. Yesterday we heard about adoption in other jurisdictions. Today we will be hearing about trends and experiences in adoption. We've got 3 speakers. The first is John Simmons. He's the Director of Policy, Research and Development at Cora Platt. He's a qualified social worker and a substantial experience of child protection, family placement and residential care sector. He's published widely, including the recent BAF Good Practice Guidance on Special Guardianship and a rapid research review of special guardianship funded by the Nuffield Legal Observatory. He sits on the Adoption and Special Guardianship Leadership Board and the Public Law Working Group. He was awarded an OBE in 2015 and the Lifetime Achievement Award at the National Adoption Week Awards. He is the adopted father of 2 children, both now adults. Our second speaker is Amanda Borman. She qualified as a social worker with a specialism of working with marginalised communities. She won the Arms Prize at Leeds University for her studies into the representation of persecuted groups within history and popular culture. After working in the voluntary sector, she went on to foster and adopt siblings with developmental trauma and complex need. This experience led to her founding a support charity, Open Nest, which campaigns for the rights of adopted and fostered individuals and their families of origin. The charity uses creative ways of raising awareness, including writing, animation and art, and provides therapeutic spaces for traumatised children and young people. Last but not least is Lucy Reed. She is a barrister at St John's Chambers in Bristol, specialising in children's work. She's a chair of the Transparency Project, which is an educational charity whose aims are to make family justice clearer. Lucy writes and speaks extensively about family law and is a well-known blogger. And I'm sure many of you will know her blog, Pink Tape. She is the author of Transparency in the Family Court, Privacy in Practice, and The Family Court Without a Lawyer. She sits as a deputy district judge and entertains many people on her Twitter account. So I'm now going to hand over the speakers, and at the end we will have a question and answer session. And please remember, put your questions in the chat box. Thank you very much. I'll now hand over to John. I hope we can find John.
Sorry. Sorry, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes, most definitely, John.
Okay. Sorry, I'd already started, and something seemed to happen at that bottom set of icons. Anyway, it's very. I'm delighted to have an opportunity to talk to you. I absolutely recognise all the issues that the Family Justice Council faced with in getting this conference together, and the persistence that it's actually taken for it to be in this very familiar format, with all the opportunities that that brings. But there are still the disadvantages in us not being able to meet face to face and chat and exchange things over coffee or lunch or whatever. The only thing I need to make sure that I'm doing is that you can actually see my PowerPoint, which doesn't seem to be coming up here. Something about opening the
John, it's Paula. Shall I get it up for you and share my screen?
Yeah, that would be fine. Yeah.
Sorry, this will take a few minutes.
Okay.
Can we see that?
Yeah. Okay, if we just go to the first slide then. Does that need to be moved down?
Sorry, it's only a PDF version, so I can't do a slideshow as such.
Okay. If I go through the slide, I've got the slides up in PowerPoint on my machine, but presumably you can't see those at the moment. All you can see is the. I mean, given the shortage of time, let me run through the slides as I've got them, and hopefully I'm clear enough in what I say to get my basic messages across. I mean, I suppose one of the fundamental things for me when it comes to thinking about adoption in the 21st century is that it returns me to one of the most fundamental things, which I think has driven so much of what I've become involved in professionally and personally over a very long period of time now. And that is this basic fact that every child needs a family for life. And everything that we've come to know from research into human development, whether that's childhood, adolescence, adulthood, indicates so strongly that every child's survival, their growth and well-being is linked to those individuals that make up the relational world. And family is at the center of that relational world. Of course, although that will expand as the child grows older, through school, through nursery, through the friends they make, through the communities that they interact with, through work and play into adulthood, etc., etc. But we are essentially who we are in that relational world, and without it, we would not survive, and we certainly would not prosper, and we would certainly not find ways of problem solving. We also know that every child will reach out into their environment from the day one, from the minute one of birth, with the expectation of a sensitive and focused response from the adults, particularly their parents, which over the course of time will enable them to survive, to be kept safe, that will promote their development in so many different ways and ensure their well-being. And for all of that, I think, and it's so easy to say and it's so obvious to say, but the role, presence and responses of parents cannot be underestimated when it comes to that fundamental issue for all of us that we needed and in different ways will have come to establish what has become our family for life. In the early stages of my career, the concept of attachment came to set out some of the core issues which I've just articulated, and particularly in the work of John Bowlby from the Tavistock, and he started that process of articulating this concept of attachment from the 1950s, identifying particularly these fundamental issues about sensitivity and responsiveness of the parent or parents in building the child's subjective experience and behavior that enables them to develop a sense of trust both in themselves and in others, a sense of continuity from one moment to the next, both in relation to the past and in relation to the future, and a deep sense of belonging to other people, that relational world that makes up that family life, that community life, however we would want to describe it. But I think the other thing, and this has particularly been emphasized through the whole COVID pandemic, is that as critical as parents are in establishing this, the wider family also plays a hugely significant part. So with my children now, one in their 30s and the other just turned 40, I'm very well aware of that family for life, including issues like the bank of mum and dad, who children come home to from university or college at the end of term, who they celebrate various significant events in their life, whether it's getting a degree or getting a qualification or starting a new job, who they grieve with, who they ask for advice and support when their first baby is born, when their baby then starts school, or when their child or children then hit puberty. And I think that the fundamental issues about parents and child are absolutely at the center of everything that we've come to understand about the nature of human development and what enables our survival. I think it's really also critically important that we don't forget that grandparents, aunts and uncles, nephews and nieces make up the world of the family, and that they will be embedded within and fundamental throughout the whole of life, as to what, again, enables that sense of survival, that sense of connection, that sense of belonging. And I suppose one of the other things that runs alongside of all of this, although I know it's, well, at the moment, it's something of a controversial issue, is Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights. And I remind myself so many times through so many different difficult sets of issues, is that convention setting out in Article 8 the right to respect for a private and family life, home and correspondence, is one of the most significant ways of setting out that families are families, and that they are private, that they create a family life for themselves, that they are established within their own home and circumstances, and have a right to the privacy of their own correspondence. It sets out a very clear border between what families themselves have a right to, and what the state can actually do when it comes to its own actions. And of course, one of the issues that we're so aware of, particularly when it comes to care proceedings and the consequences of care proceedings, the role of the court, the role of the professionals that work within the courts, and of course, all of these issues when it comes to private law proceedings too, is that that is a very contested, or that can become a very contested, a very tense and a very difficult set of issues in the way that we maintain that right to respect for private and family life, home and correspondence, but where the state has a role in protecting children where there are risks, and particularly where there's evidence of maltreatment when it comes to public law proceedings and children in care. And I think in my view, that right needs to be, or is, one of the fundamental issues when it comes to the court's decision about what the child's care plan is going to be, how that becomes authorised, and particularly when it comes to the issue of permanence. Who is going to become this child's permanent family for life as a result of the decisions that a court actually makes? So that concept of permanence, and particularly when it comes to adoption and now special guardianship, that they seem to me to be absolutely at the centre of how, although it's something of a struggle, come to identify that when there's a question about the children who are maltreated, the child's need for and respect for their private and family life and their need for a family for life, that permanence and the orders that support permanence are hugely significant. And I think that evolution of permanence, it started in the 1970s. I think it was game-changing, and it placed the child's subjective experience of their forever family above that of the parent's claim to a child, although for most children they will be the same people. It became embedded in, and I'm totally in love with the Children Act 89, although it's some years ago. I think that there is, it was so fundamental in setting out the paramountcy principle of the child's welfare when it came to any issues before the courts. And I think it's really driven a very powerful set of issues in respecting the child's development, the child's needs, the child's welfare, the child's safety, when there are any questions that come up about whether that's actually crossing the border of significant harm. At the same time, we also know that there is nothing straightforward in any of this. There are continuous legal challenges to the way that the system operates, to the decisions that it actually makes, and to the outcomes of care proceedings and other court proceedings as well. They're also subject to political controversy. Different governments have different views about how to prioritise and deliver these services, and to ensure that that the law is fully and properly in place when it comes to many of the issues that I've raised in the last 10 minutes or so. We know that there are significant resource challenges. There are issues about the expertise and stability of the workforce. There are service delivery issues when it comes to services such as health and education. And there are also all the unknowns, the things that we can't predict, the things that come along in an unexpected and unpredictable fashion. But despite all of this, I don't think there's any doubt that children who have been subject to experiences that have had a serious impact on their welfare, their well-being and their development will need a level of parenting, family and community life that is plus. It's not just a question of the order being made, the child being placed, and everybody being left to get on with it. There are significant challenges that both the child and the immediate family and the wider family and the community will face in trying to get the child back onto something of a normal developmental pathway. And we know that adopters and special guardians in particular have to make major adjustments for themselves, both in relation to their thoughts, feelings and actions as adults, as parents, and indeed as family members. Now, this slide, I think, is one that you really needed to see. And I don't know whether you can get this one up, Paula. It's the adoption and special guardianship graph. So this actually shows the change in the number of orders since 2009. Is it possible to get that one up?
Sorry, I'm just trying now. Can you see the graph?
Okay, well, I'll talk to it. So these are the statistics of the data of children that leave care either through an adoption or a special guardianship order. So there's quite a rise and then fall off in these statistics over from 2009 up to 2020. So in 2009, we're seeing about 3,330 children leaving care through adoption. There's some significant rise. So in 2015, that rises to 5,360. And then there's a quite dramatic drop off since 2015. So in 2020, it's dropped to 3,440 children leaving care through the making of an adoption order. So I wanted to go on to explore some of the issues that might underpin that drop. If you could look at special guardianship, so here we've got 1,240 children leaving care through a special guardianship order. That rises to 3,860 in 2016, and it levels off somewhat, but ends up at 3,700 children leaving care through a special guardianship order in 2020. So it's now, special guardianship has now become the larger or the most significant order when it comes to children leaving care on a permanence order. Recent statistics that I've seen suggests that certainly the number of children leaving care through adoption through 2020 to the third quarter of 2021 has dropped off significantly. So my anticipation is that over the next 2 or 3 years, we're probably going to see adoption dropping off to something like 3,000 children, if not less than that. Certainly that quarter, the data that I've just seen, which I can't put up here, suggests that it's falling off. And I think there's a lot to suggest that special guardianship order will continue to rise, but it's much more difficult to predict that because I don't have any of the planning data on that. So what does that actually tell us? How come that there are these fluctuations? Well, the first thing I think it says is the family replacement sector is subject to significant change in time. That's always been the case. I mean, we had 25,000 children leaving care through adoption, or no, not leaving care through adoption, but being adopted in 1968, 25,000. What explains this? Well, I think the 2015 figure is probably the impact of Re-B and Re-BS. So two very significant judgments. It really did raise the bar, I think, when it came to courts agreeing a placement order, a care order and a placement order, and the child being placed for adoption. And there is that specific phrase that was used where nothing else will do. We've also seen the evolution of special guardianship, although I don't think this has necessarily been very straightforward, in becoming a family-based resolution to care proceedings. 90% of special guardianship orders are made to kinship carers. So that's become hugely significant, and indeed it fits in very significantly, I think, with Article 8. We've also seen some very significant organisational changes. So the major reordering of adoption services into regional adoption agencies plus voluntary adoption agencies. That's been a huge sector change. There are also the questions about what are the strategic and operational drivers for regional adoption agencies. Care planning, so local authorities still continue to have responsibility for care planning for children. And I think there are lots of questions about the confidence of local authorities when it comes to care planning, particularly when adoption has been split off for its expertise into regional adoption agencies. So there are lots of questions around, I think, about the evidence and approach of local authorities and the local courts. We're all very familiar with the underfunding of public services, whether that's local authorities, but also health and education, and indeed, I think, the courts. And then there are these continuing issues about the discomfort that adoption brings when it comes to the impact and consequences for birth parents, given their age, circumstances, and when their children are actually moved. There has to be a continuing concern that these children, that those parents are not just left to get on with it, because the consequences of what they faced, even when their children have been put at risk, can't be underestimated. And we do have significant duties and responsibilities to those people. So what are the solutions to any of this? This needs discussion, debate of some significance. But I think it seems important to me that we have to remind ourselves that every child needs a stable, secure and loving family for life. And I suppose one of the big issues for me when it comes to the independent children's care review is that while I think permanence and adoption special guardianship certainly are very significant when it comes to establishing a family for life, when it comes to foster care, it ends at 18, and even if there are various services that might go on until the child is, or to the adult is 25, that I think there are huge issues about whether we can honestly say that foster care creates a stable, secure and loving family for life. We have to build on the expertise and experience of the sector in a lawful, focused, problem-solving, child and family-centred way. And I don't think that we can underestimate just how much we've learned and come to understand and are committed to when it comes to the sector's expertise and experience. And I think that the third issue is the importance of recognising that the best of what we do results from a relational world. We live in a relational world of discussion, reflection, openness, support, and action. And how we come to tackle the issues that we're currently faced with, I think, are hugely dependent on recognising that relational world and the need for us to discuss, reflect, be open, support, and then take action. So 21st century for adoption, my last slide, the coming together of the basic human drivers of emotion, thinking and action cannot be overemphasized. They drive the best of what we do in adoption and indeed in other forms of permanence. They inform the fundamentals of adoptive family life as well as special guardianship. And I think that they need to, when it comes to fostering, they are what I've come to understand as being 21st century adoption. That's it.
John, thank you very much indeed for an extremely informative talk. Very grateful to you. And now we'll move on to Amanda Borman.
Hello. Hopefully you can see me. If someone can just let me know that that's happening.
We can see you. Yes, thank you.
Jolly good. Thank you very much. Well, thank you to the Family Justice Council for inviting me to speak today. Sorry I haven't got a formal background, I couldn't work that out. This is actually my first ever attempt at anything like this, so all I can see is everyone that's here in the audience is just a little round dot, which makes it very strange. But anyway, I'll do my best. So, my background with adoption is that I had a child placed with me for adoption over 20 years ago, and since then, through meeting the children, the child that was placed with me and her siblings, it's taken me obviously into this world very, very deeply. The first thing that I had to do that felt at odds for me was to have to take the child placed with me to say goodbye forever to her siblings at a Wacky Warehouse. She was 5, the other siblings were 6 and 4, and it was really quite a horrendous experience. And I think I was doing what I was told by the adoption social worker, but as I was doing it, didn't make sense at all. To say goodbye forever at such a young age seemed terrible to me. So after that, I spoke to the adoption social workers and asked if we could maybe change that. The oldest sibling had actually been put into care quite a long way away from home and therefore away from us. And the younger sibling was going to be adopted to another couple. So I contacted them and we spoke about things and we started to arrange to meet up. And that's what we did until eventually I also applied to have the older sibling placed with me also for adoption. That process unfortunately took 7 years. Eventually I had to go through the court system as my child's next best friend, I think it was called, in order to initially fight for contact. The contact that we had with the older sibling who was in a children's home was really patchy because it depended on whatever his care plan was at the time. So sometimes it was viewed as a good idea by some people, and depending on it, he moved around a lot to different homes. And sometimes it was thought that it was no good for him, the contact. The children's parents were not involved in any kind of plan of contact at all. And that also began to play on my mind as I got to know the children, and see they show you things and tell you things, and I listened to my adopted child from a very early age, really listened to what she was saying to me and what she was telling me. And it was clear that she was worried about her parents, she was still thinking about them. She had mixed feelings, it was clear, because she wanted to see them and then she wanted to shoot them, and she was very expressive. Another thing that was happening alongside that was what was called results of trauma, mainly assigned to the situation in her birth family. She was traumatized by that, and what I was seeing in this challenging behaviour was a result of that. I think it's a bit more complex than that. And as I spoke to her and listened to her, it seemed to me that some of the trauma was actually the severance. She was 4 at the age of removal, was completely removed from that home and her siblings at that point, was then in foster care for a year before being moved to me. So there was a huge losses in all of that, and they seem to be underplayed. It brought to mind a quote that I wanted to say from Lem Sisse, actually, who had obviously a very bad time in care and had a sort of quasi-adoption that broke down as well. What he's saying is dysfunction is a true reaction to untruth. And that to some way sums up what I felt was going on for my daughter, that there was this, she was placed with me happy ever after. And that clearly wasn't what was going on for her and not what she was telling me. And I had to sort of unpick that over many years, which eventually led me to finding her parents and reuniting both her and her brother with them. That was a very long story, which I don't have time for now. But I thought it'd be interesting to talk about my motivations and what led me to adopting in the first place, because I think so much funding has been put into particularly adoption recruitment, and I hate the word, to use the word in relation to children, but adoption marketing. You will find a lot of the adoption government adoption papers talk about marketing and recruitment an awful lot. That is the key priority. So I was of a generation who, I did a social work qualification, a CQSW, which in my case meant that I worked with people who are victims of domestic abuse, people in the travelling community, people who were addicted, people with mental health issues, adults with learning disabilities. And actually, those are the groups that often find themselves involved in child protection and having children removed. I also had friends who had had very bad experiences in care. On top of that, politically, I suppose it was a time where we were sort of fighting against for gay rights and women's rights and free parties even, and also a lot of concern about the climate and so on. So for me, even though it may have been a naive decision, my decision to adopt was a first choice. As far as aware, I could have had children, but to me it was about sharing of resources to somebody else that may not have them. And I remember very distinctly asking the social worker who was matching me with the child, are you absolutely sure that everything has been done for the parents, and that this isn't a thing that I've heard of and worried about in this process, that I'm a person with resources, I have a privileged background, and are you just going to remove somebody from who is struggling, who doesn't have resources, and shift them over to me as a solution? And I was very much assured that the children's parents were, well, all I can say is very, very negative. There wasn't much. In fact, it was quite scary. As well as negative, it was scary. I was not to. I was to avoid them, avoid the town that they lived, that I may be attacked. It was a bit like being. I always say it's a bit like being witness protection. Be really careful. You know, change the child's name. All these kind of things. But one thing that was said in my assessment, that I would be a good advocate for a child, for an adopted child, and that is really what I set out to do. My professional career was generally in advocacy, and that's what I decided I was going to do. And that did lead me, in true advocacy, to listen to the children and follow what they wished of me. And certainly that was to see each other. That was a huge priority for them, and also to know that their parents were okay. I think it's important to say that the children were from a chaotic, neglectful background, and although I have co-parented them with their parents, it would have been difficult for the parents to manage that, and they would admit that, and do admit that themselves. Once the children got to 18, that's when I started the Open Nest charity to advocate for adoptees and their families. And we made sure at that point that adoptees made up the largest proportion of our trustees. And it also gave the children a chance to speak out themselves about their experiences as adults, which I think is lacking quite often out in the sector. One of the things I like to talk about, I'm just keeping an eye on the time, is over that 20 years since I had a child placed for adoption, so much has happened. Millions and millions of pounds has been spent, definitely, on adoption. But starting right at the beginning, for me, a child was placed with me in 1999. And from then to now, so many different papers and government reports and things have been written. But I wanted to read out a couple of quotes from high-profile adoptees that really give, showing the different. I feel that there's two very different views on it, and I think these two. So the first one is Michael Gove, who was very much behind the sort of adoption reforms of 2011. So he's saying, adoption is, in every sense of the word, for good, and the readiness of adults to make such a firm and unselfish commitment for a child they cannot know is, to my mind, an inspirational example of humanity at its best. The other quote is Jeanette Winterson, and hers. She says, where you are born, what you were born into, the place, the history of that place, how that history mates with your own, stamps who you are, whatever the pundits of globalization have to say. So I wanted to just, for the purposes of this, to go just very quickly through the key things that I feel have happened over the 20 years and things that I've studied at great length over many hours. So the first one would be in 2000, there was the white paper, Adoption, a New Approach with Tony Blair. 2011, quite controversial in many ways, was Martin Nary's blueprint for the nation's lost children. That was, I found that quite, as an adopter at the time, I remember quite sort of striking that it was commissioned by the Times and behind a paywall, and also that Martin Nary was called the Tsar. It felt like a time of very much like, right, there's no messing about here, and we're going to get on with this and we're going to get more adoptions done. And very much at the time, there were some questions about social work performance around adoption, whether it was social workers who weren't quite keen on this, and even some accusations that social workers were quite happy that words like languishing and forgotten and lost and so on, that these children, that social workers weren't doing the right thing. Also within that, contact was something that was criticised, I would say, although it may have been veiled criticism, it was criticised at that point. In 2013, there was a select committee, the House of Lords Select Committee on Adoption, and the Adoption Czar gave evidence to that and suggested that contact was hurtful to adopted parents as the new family, and also off-putting to potential adopters, which I found, my experiences running alongside that were that definitely the children I was caring for needed more contact and needed more information. And so did I, because in order to parent somebody permanently for the rest of their lives, you do need to know who that person is and where they come from. And I had very little myself. I had lots of negative reports and so on, but not very much at all. Beyond also the parents, I didn't know any more about the wider family. In 2013 came the care inquiry, which I remember attending the launch of that. And that very, very much was talking about how important relationships were and links and connections for children. And I thought it was very telling there because there were adoption agencies involved in that. Following on from that, there was the launch of the Adoption Leadership Board in 2014 to oversee a national marketing strategy to boost recruitment of adoptive parents. 2016, another blueprint for adoption, more of the same really, adoption, a vision for change. In 2018, the British Association of Social Workers launched the adoption inquiry, brought out the adoption inquiry, which was years of work and research into the social worker's perspective, and also very much focusing on ethics in practice. It was to be a refreshing thing. I took part in that as an individual, but also in terms of the charity as an organisation. And it was refreshing in that it brought adult adoptees and adopters and birth parents and social workers together in roundtable discussions. One of the things there, that a quote from that report is, support for post-adoption contact between adopted children and their birth families was under-resourced with little follow-up from services if letterbox was ended unilaterally by any of the parties. Bringing us more recently, 2020, a government letter was sent to directors of children's services urging them to make adoption a priority in permanence planning. So throughout all of that, that's a lot of paperwork, a lot of time, a lot of hours, a lot of research. It's very difficult to find adult adopted voices within that, and also very much about the importance of history for people who are adopted, or contact with their family, birth families. I've tried to think for this about what are the issues? What are the issues that make this happen? One of them obviously is that contact is low on the agenda. I think that does come from the thoughts of it's not good for recruitment of adopters, that it's complex to manage, probably expensive in that sense. It reminds me, though, of the tokens at the Family Museum. that somebody would leave their baby with a token in the hope that they might be reunited, and actually generally the child's name was changed, the child was baptized into the church, and it would be quite difficult for that reuniting. And I sometimes wonder now that contact orders are as tokenistic as that. I think that power is held by adopters, and it's not always their fault. It is complicated to manage. I know that myself, and it's not a happy. In as much as adoption isn't a happy ending, neither is reunification always. It's a complex thing with lots of different feelings involved that needs to be managed very sensitively and carefully. Another thing I feel that gets in the way is a narrative of saving. Lost children, languishing children, saving. Again, it goes back, not a lot has changed since the days of the Foundling Museum, that sense of charitable saving. And I think we have to be very careful as we move forward, particularly with appealing to faith communities, that adoption is something that you should do as a religious calling. I think we have to be very careful of that saving narrative, because within that, it's you're saying the assessment of adoption is this parent good enough to adopt? And adopters will say what a grueling process that is, but equally within that, the other side is this parent bad enough to lose their child? Over the 20 years, I've seen adoption influencers. I suppose that the fact I'm here makes me one of them myself. I'm an adopter. Most people that are influencing adoption are adopters. Lots of adopters work for big organisations. Lots of people get rewarded with public rewards. Adopters who are promoting the cause and helping recruitment and trying to improve the numbers. So I think that in a way makes it, if adopters are not always keen on managing contact or not helped to manage that, and they are the influencers, then I think that keeps contact lower on the agenda. Other thing I think gets in the way is perhaps the marketing of adoption. I don't think generally, there's been a lot of marketing campaigns, millions of pounds spent on recruitment, and that's involved recruiting at supermarkets, putting children's profiles on Twitter, marketing at Pride events, those kind of things. It makes it a very much putting it in a kind of consumer area, which I know certainly adopted people find quite difficult, because they can feel with this consumer approach to it all and the marketing of a sort of a happy ending, that puts them in a position of being consumed, is the best way I can put it. So I tried to have a sort of solutions thing, and I think adopted adults have to be central to the planning on boards, in adoption reform, in conferences, on social media. I've got a quote from one of an adoptee that was a trustee of ours, and she's saying that the lack of involvement of adoptees in adoption reform is outstanding, and I'm glad people are speaking about this. Most people would take a dim view of a government organisation intended to help LGBT teenagers that did not contain any LGBT people on its boards. And I think to me that is really is the elephant in the room. I've studied reports that this is missing and needs to change. As a charity, we have talked about this for years, and I don't understand why it remains the way it does. I think the other thing that could be, I think the Article 8 that John was talking about, right to correspondence, I think that could go further to right to history. There has to be better ways of gathering In my children's case, I'm guessing that I've got 2 minutes there. Yes, I've got 2 minutes. In my children's case, their parents could not look after them. It was right that they were parented by other people. However, I didn't get anything about their history, and as I've searched their history, it is rich. It is full of interesting characters. It is full of loving characters. There are other family members we're now in touch with. We are now 2 melded families, and all of that was thrown away. That's what happens, the saving, but also the throwing away. As I've only got 2 minutes, I think honest marketing, adoption is caring for someone else's child. It's not your child. It's someone else's child that you are adopting or caring for life. But I am glad to hear the guardianships are on the rise. I think that would be a new model. I certainly did not need to change my child's surname. It's not, for me, it wasn't an ownership thing, it was a guardianship thing. And so I hope that more models of that kind could be considered. And finally, a framework for total severance. What makes somebody deserve to never see their child again? We need to have an actual framework for what society believes is bad enough for that. Thanks very much.
Amanda, that was fascinating. Thank you very much indeed. Wonderful talk. Now we will go to Lucy Reed. Lucy.
Hello. Can you hear me, first of all?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Now, I've got 20 minutes to tell you something meaningful about adoption in the 21st century, and I'm going to use it to tell you about a real scenario in my own extended family. And although it involves adoption in various guises, the circumstances are very different from the sorts of child protection, non-consensual adoption scenario that applies in many of the cases we deal with in the family court in England and Wales, and which the 2 previous speakers have been talking about. But I hope it will illustrate some phenomena that apply across the board to adopted children and to adopted adults throughout their lives. My story concerns my husband. I have his consent, by the way, to share the contents of this talk, and I've scripted this presentation with him. So if I look like I'm reading from a script, that's because I am. It's really important that what I say has his blessings. I'm going to stick to script. My husband is in his 50s. He was born in the States, where adoption is used in some contexts where we would not use it. There is more intrafamilial and step-parent adoption and more relinquishment. Michael was adopted at the age of 2, and again as a teenager, by his first and then his second stepfathers. He never met or knew his biological father. He wasn't given information about his father by his mother, and most of what he knows, he's found out for himself over time. In the early years of the 21st century, when we were starting a family, he'd made intermittent attempts to find his father using the internet. He'd been unable to locate him online. Back in the 90s, he'd found 3 possible candidates, 1 alive, 2 dead, from online public records, but none of them could be confirmed, and he was unable to find a further lead, even at this stage. And people of his father's generation didn't often show up on social media even a decade ago, and the availability of searchable databases was much more limited. Now, the topic had gone quiet for several years when in late 2017, my husband asked for a DNA test kit for Christmas. It cost £60 and it changed everything. The testing service was called 23andMe, and initially Michael's objective was to find out more about his heritage. There were family stories about Native American blood in the family, but they were really difficult to piece together. And he wanted to see if the ethnicity profiling service would shed any light on this. It didn't. It was wildly inconsistent and pretty much meaningless, but it was just a bit of a novelty Christmas present, and it gave me an opportunity to say, I told you so. But there was more going on. Michael has always had a powerful drive to find out about his father. He had a relationship with his biological mother and a connection and shared history with the maternal side of his biological family. He'd been raised by a biological parent and he considers his adoptive father to be his dad, but he still had that drive. His own mother had been adopted as a baby by extended family after her own mother became sick and died. Michael was raised in a blended family of many siblings and step-siblings. One sibling had been adopted by Michael's parents at birth after a relinquishment by high school-aged parents, and he was later reunited with his biological parents through my husband, due to an unusual combination of surnames associated with his profile on a photo sharing site. That sibling's parents are still together, and he has 2 full siblings with whom he is now in regular contact, and he himself has become an adopter of children within the family who have lost a parent themselves. Finally, two other of Michael's siblings were themselves adopted from within the family. So you see why, when explaining his family tree, Michael often says, well, my mother is the only person in my family tree who's in the right place. In numerous fallow periods over the years, Michael put off doing more, not just because it was logistically difficult to find a parent on another continent, but also because it was just difficult to talk to his own mother, who was and is reluctant to talk about it at all. And my sense as the partner of someone in this situation is that there comes a time when you just can't put it off anymore. It increases at different stages in life, particularly when children are born. And in Michael's case, that coincided with an expansion of what was possible. It became important to find out more about his father's own medical history for his own health reasons, for the benefit of the children. Had he or they inherited anything? He wanted to be able to hand down some sort of history to the children about their grandfather. And of course, when you reach your 50s, you perhaps realise that the time to find a lost parent is running out. And when we talked about what I would say today, he told me on this topic of his motivation to look for his father. There's a general need to understand our own psychological makeup and character, as well as medical history, possibly something that those of us who grow up with their biological families take for granted. We never get to hear, we never get to say or hear, oh, you're just like your dad when you do that. So back to 23andMe. The ethnicity profiling was rubbish, but it turned out when you send in your sample, you can opt in to a DNA matching service. And I didn't know anything about this when I bought the test kit. It enables you also to download your DNA profile and then upload it to other databases such as GEDmatch. And that's an international free database of DNA profiles, which is perhaps best known because it was used to catch the Golden Gate serial killer. 23andMe identified a first cousin for Mike. Most matches are more distant, say 3rd to 5th cousins. But that first cousin made contact through the site. And after exploring common family names, it came to light that the cousin's aunt was the mother of one of the 3 individuals that Michael had previously identified as possible candidates for his biological father. And that link was later confirmed to be his paternal grandmother. Now, when we combine this information with Facebook, we quickly found cousins, a half-sister he didn't know he had, and an aunt and an uncle. Sadly, we also received confirmation that his father had died in the 1990s. But what Michael did get was some sort of blurry explanation about his father, his own early life, and his parents' complicated relationship, which I won't go into. Michael's father was a Vietnam veteran, and trying to piece things together, we think he probably had what we would now call PTSD. They called it Vietnam syndrome. And we now have some sense of perhaps why Michael's mum has found that period of her life difficult to talk about. Having made connections with surviving relatives, Michael's aunt sent us a self-published book written by his great-grandfather, who was a Midwestern farmer, and we've read that with our children. We've received in the post a battered old quilt, hand-sewn by his grandmother the year after Michael was born, and a book of evangelical hymns written by a minister cousin. And Michael has, for the first time, a photograph of his father, a beautiful black and white picture of his father in uniform as a young man, and they are the spit of one another. And I can tell you that photograph is of huge significance to him. These are small but important things. Now, since I prepared a first draft of this talk with Michael before COVID hit, he's continued to build relationships with his extended paternal family and to research his family tree, something he gains some real satisfaction from. He's working with a second cousin who's in his 70s and who was abandoned at birth, helping him to try to identify his parents, who will almost certainly now be past, but whose name he has never known. He too is searching for his identity. And together they have managed to narrow down his parentage to a group of siblings, and they're in the process of writing to those who are alive and the relatives of those who are not. And the use of genetics in combination with online records has made the piecing together of identity possible, even for those late in life like this cousin. And those unanswered questions about identity still matter then too. As more records are digitised, this will become easier, and the notion of a truly closed adoption even more difficult to maintain. But there are still some answers that can't be found. We have found out about other now elderly adults within the family network who were never told the name they were given at birth, and for whom there is no surviving record we can find nor relative to ask. Now, to never know the name your mother gave you at birth, it is such a profound loss. So I have two thoughts to leave with. Firstly, the practical implications. Here, where adoption is almost exclusively non-consensual, we're increasingly aware of the impact of social media on the way we do adoption. But the potential, the DNA, in combination with social media, to be used to locate biological parents or adopted children is a reality that I think we've yet to fully absorb and grapple with. It's both an opportunity and a risk, and has potential relevance to the choices we make about adoptive placements, post-adoption contact, life story work, and to the broader ways we support adoptive parents and adoptive children in the long term. There is potential to stumble over family secrets you weren't ready for. For example, in Michael's case, he's worked out there are relinquished babies in the extended family that others apparently still don't know exist. And he's also found out more about the maternal family tree, including an uncle with a conviction for murder that nobody thought to mention to him. There's lots of potential to find that there is a difference between one family member's recollection, perspective or narrative and what the records or the account of a found family member will suggest. Michael says diplomatically that the potential to be exposed to other perspectives of the family narrative can bring challenge. And of course, the process works both ways. There's potential to find or to be found. Not only can adoptees search for their own adopted families, adopted children can also be located by their biological parents or their siblings. They don't even necessarily need to be on a database themselves if an extended family member's DNA that they are connected to by name or social media has been uploaded to a DNA database. And all of this could potentially unfold when either an adopted child or the biological family are not ready, and potentially when they're not supported or safe. Secondly, and in some ways most importantly, we need to remember when making decisions for small babies and young children that the child's need to know where she comes from will be lifelong. It's not just a question of a life storybook and safely navigating an adopted child through to the age of 18. One day they will be 30, 50, 70, and the unanswered questions will travel with them, and the need for connection will continue to drive them through all the chapters of their life. And that has really brought the statutory test of welfare throughout their lives off the page for me. Thank you.
Lucy, thank you very much indeed. And now we have questions for all the panelists. So I don't know if Amanda and John are able to put their cameras on as well. There is a question, first of all, can confidential adoption survive social media? I don't know who might go first on that. John, possibly?
Well, I do think social media has opened up the issues of adoption. in what was an unexpected and unplanned for way. And there are plenty of examples where, well, I know with my own daughter that social media has definitely opened up a set of relationships that probably wouldn't have happened if there was an intermediary, or particularly if there was an adoption agency. She managed to find people in her birth family that that were on social media. I don't know how she did it. I'm not familiar with social media, but it was hugely significant for her. There are other sides of the story too, of social media opening things up in an uncontrolled and unmanageable way. And it creates issues both for the child or young person themselves, and for the adoptive parents, and often for the birth parents too. I mean, so I suppose it is one of these complex issues about, social media has definitely provided opportunities. It definitely has provided opportunities. But as with so much of what we've come to learn, is it's become one of the fundamental ways of we communicating and making contact with another. There are huge risks in that too, and but controlling it, well, we don't seem to be any closer to being able to control that in a helpful way. So it's something definitely to be acknowledged. It definitely has its advantages, but we also have to be. We need to be careful, thoughtful.
Yes, thank you. Lucy, your talk really does reveal the importance of lifelong identity. And what's your view about that? Confidential adoption surviving social media.
I don't think the way that we recruit adopters, think about post-adoption contact or plan how adoption will work post-order really acknowledges what might happen further down the line, both in terms of the child's need for identity contact, or in terms of the risks of it happening even if you try to lock down a placement. And I think that's what worries me really, is that when I'm in court dealing with an application for care or placement orders, or even at adoption order stage, there is still often for good reason real reluctance to think about adoption, and adopters are still being recruited without having really thought through those options. And I think we're setting up lots of families for additional pressures that they might perhaps not be properly supported to manage in years to come. And I think that's letting down the children that we're sending off for adoption. And it matters as well because, as I said at the end of my talk, somebody has to make the decision that this is the only option that will do for a child. And we do have to think about these potential lifelong consequences. It's difficult for a judge sitting making a decision about a baby or a young child to hypothesize for 70 years in the future. But we have to all understand that these are the possible futures for our children when they become adults and elderly people, that they may still be being impacted by that decision.
Thank you. And Amanda, obviously you have direct experience of looking after children in these circumstances. What do you feel about social media and confidential adoptions?
Aside from social media, I think it would be nice not to leave anybody ethically in a situation where they're having to search for their own identity and information. I would like to see a lot of funding put into independent, people watch Long Lost Family, hearing Lucy's husband's story, surely that evidence could be gathered. That must be in the best interests of children. Because some of the information for my children that should have been gathered was about their auntie who's a police officer, about their great-grandmother who was one of the first black singers in the West End, about the Ghanaian prince, about there are people have a right to their identity and their information, and that should then be provided for them as and when the time's right with skilled support.
Thank you. Can I go to the next question? And that is, how can a better understanding of identity be built into the process? I don't know who should go first with that. Lucy, maybe?
I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer, but I think life story books as I currently hear about them, and I only have a limited perspective, are probably not they're not the solution. They are a small part of what is needed. I mean, what's really struck me about the experiences within our family is the richness of the information that we found out. And I think a few photos in a book that's static is very different from lived experience and communicating with people that knew your family, and finding out the little things that don't seem important enough to write down in a life story book. So I think we have to have a broader thinking about identity and life story books.
Yes, thank you. I suppose indirect contact plays some part in that, but of course direct contact might be different still. John, have you got any? What?
Well, yes, I suppose one of the things for me, and it's a kind of theme that kind of resonates with me through listening this evening is just this: we are who we are. So in one sense, identity. On the basis of the relationships that we have with others, but also with ourselves. So the kind of sense of building up a picture of oneself, what we can do, what we do well, what we don't do so well, our ambitions, our beliefs, our values. They fundamentally come to define who we are. Other people will see that. Some people will respond to that in a positive way. We know, particularly with issues of racism or discrimination when it comes to LGBT issues or to women, that how we are seen by others does not necessarily accord with how we try to develop a positive sense of who we are inside of ourselves. But it is so fundamental to that relational world, both the relationship we have with ourselves and the relationship that we have with others. So I think all of these issues about contact, it's an issue about relationships. It's building up a sense of my history, who I am, what I do, what I struggle with. And I think that that's come across so very strongly in the presentations that we've heard this evening. So identity is, some of the things I struggle with, particularly with the Adoption Support Fund. There's a lot of money being spent on that, and I'm not wanting to put it down at all. But I think that those fundamental issues about how children and the people that children have contact with or have relationships with essentially build up that fundamental set of answers to that question about who am I and how am I seen by others. Thank you.
And Amanda, I'm very taken by one of the things you said in your talk about this is not your child, you have adopted this child. And that seems to me to go to the question of identity.
Well, yes, I mean, adoption is supposed to be in the best interests of the child, not to serve in creating a new identity so that someone can feel. Often there's an argument of adopted children need to have a sense of belonging, so therefore they need to be taken in and adopted and know that that is their permanent family. But I think that sense of belonging also can be just as attributed to what adopters want or need. I wanted to say, though, in terms of identity, for me, if I had been not a curious person, not an advocate for adoptees, I would not have found out the history, because the recordings that needed to sit there that made it that family bad enough to never see their children again, if I had not pushed for that, which was very difficult, my children's identity would have, their parents were very, very negatively presented. And yet their mother is a vulnerable woman, had terrible care experiences herself, deserved some empathy for that. But what was written about her in terms of her identity, which is then passed on to children, was very, very negative. So I think there's something to be said in how people are. There needs to be independent agencies gathering history, I believe, and talking to family members and recording and photographs. And I mean, that's what I did for my children. I met the parents first before they even knew anything about it. Started to gather video clips and stories and stuff like that.
Thank you. Amanda, the next question is for you. How could training and marketing of adoption change to promote maintaining relationships with birth family contact?
Oh, big question.
It is, but very important.
I feel quite strongly about the marketing and recruitment, really. I find it, from certainly from if you're an adoptee, an adult, when you see that and how things are marketed, I do think it's even the words in reports and things are very much about, there's money in it. There's saving money, or there's money to be made in it. There's marketing, there's recruitment, or they're very business-like words. As a charity, we did a job description for adopters. It's too long to say it now, but the crux of it is, are you prepared to care for someone else's child and their history? So that's, I would find people who want to be, I think really, although nothing to do with the love for my loved ones, but for me, adoption doesn't fit. As a family, we don't believe in it, really. So that's a difficult one. I don't know that I think I would be looking at recruiting guardians, people who are willing to care for other people's children permanently. And that sometimes can be in unusual family setups. It worked. I went in as a single adopter. It worked for me because I had a group of friends who became, we're an unusual, unrelated family, all of us. And that's how it worked for us. So I think there are people who would be willing to do that.
Thank you very much. The next question we have is, what strategies could be built in to enable children to benefit from the permanence offered by strong sibling attachments? John?
Recognizing that your brothers and sisters are probably the most significant long-standing relationships that you will have over the entirety of your life. I mean, I think that there's I would like us to return to saying brothers and sisters, and I think that the issue about siblings kind of it just gives us one step away again from that that relational world of and it's not that sibling relationships are always straightforward, as I'm sure we're all very aware, but it is such a fundamental part of a child's sense of both who they are, who they have relationships with, who they learn from, whose shoulders that they might cry on, who they might discuss their latest relationship or their latest exercise or homework at work. And I suppose it was a part of my emphasis about kind of family for life. And we've reflected on some of the complexities of that when it comes to family placement, and particularly for adoption. But family for life actually means well beyond the parents, to brothers and sisters, to aunts and uncles, to nephews and nieces, to those people that we build up a set of links with. It's the relational world that we become embedded within. And I just don't think that we can underestimate the huge significance and also the huge issues that are created for adopted children when they're separated from their brothers and sisters. And there may be some attempt to kind of rebuild that, but it never seems particularly straightforward. And I think it's another area of significant loss for children where attention is not paid to that particular set of relationships. But I'd like us to kind of turn to the use of brothers and sisters, maybe rather than siblings.
Thank you very much. Lucy, obviously your husband's situation threw up a number of issues about siblings and such like. What's your view about strategies that could be built in to enable children to benefit?
I don't know about practical strategies, but I suppose I would want to re-emphasise, not only from sort of family experience, but from work in practice, that the importance of siblings when we're making care plans for children is just so important. A lot of my parent clients have been looked after children whose own relationships with their siblings have not been properly sustained, and I don't think we're always getting that right. I can see there's a really interesting description in the chat of a new setup in Bristol, a sharing story service, which I haven't heard of, even though it's my neck of the woods. which builds relationships with birth family members, not just parents, it says, in an ongoing and flexible way to support them to engage with life story work and support identity. I mean, that's, you know, that's obviously one practical strategy that is being built in Bristol, and that sounds really fantastic. But I do think that very often with placement changes where siblings are placed separately, the question of contact just gets deprioritised when social workers move and placements change, but it's just so important to keep it going.
Thank you. Amanda?
Well, I think the best, I was maybe as people were talking, maybe I think the best thing I could do is read something from somebody that's experienced that themselves, which is something that we gathered from somebody for the charity, which is, I see the social worker standing at the front door with the clipboard. A policeman carries me to the door and the social worker sits me in the car. I can't breathe properly and my clothes are wet. I can't see my family. Then I see my brothers go into a different car, but they won't let us speak to each other. I feel sick. They all scratch their heads wondering what to do with me and what was wrong. I felt like ripping my heart out of my chest and showing them the diagnosis. Broken heart from losing parents, brothers and hopes. And the reason I read that is because that is somebody's experience directly, but also it does very much mirror what my children have said to me about their feelings at the time. It's absolutely traumatic for children to be separated from each other. And in our case, I was able to, actually didn't have my daughter's brother placed for adoption. We agreed on long-term fostering. But for them, that was very, very traumatic indeed. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Now we've got one more question. Well, we might have two more questions. We've got the next one is, with adoptive placements, should we be more active in understanding the need to know about the birth family, however difficult the background is? I think this follows on from something you said, Amanda, about getting to know more about the birth family's background.
Yes, it is. In my case, I gathered the evidence like a historian, as much as I possibly could, interviewed people, gathered things, made connections, researched, everything, good and bad. If it's been a difficult situation, which it was for the children at home, they shouldn't have been there. Their mum is my friend now. She would admit herself she couldn't cope. That didn't mean she deserved to never see her children again. And actually, in the 20 years that I've been involved in adoption, I have not met anyone that I felt didn't deserve to ever see their children. I realise there are awful situations, terrible, abusive people that do not deserve to see their children, have contact even perhaps. But I don't think that's the majority. When you look at the groups of people, and women particularly, who lose their children, that's what I would like to see. What would mean somebody deserves never to see their children again? What is the bar? But yes, gathering, knowing about so for the children, knowing what their mother's life was like in care, what happened to her, why she failed. Even though that failure was horrible for them because they were damaged by it, having a reason why and what the story was, what led to that for her, why she ended up in care and so on.
Thank you. John?
Well, I mean, I think it's one of these issues about the kind of the nature of relations and relatedness. You know, part of that is the capacity to, firstly, the importance of being curious, the issue about forgiveness, the issue about understanding, the issue about empathy, and you know, that they are the nature, they're the best of who we are as human beings. And you know, so I think to kind of have a blanket ban, you know, because it was so awful, or to feel that you know, to condemn a birth mother or birth father, whoever, in a particular way, it doesn't. we need to be more open, more reflective, more thoughtful about these issues, and also to recognise, as I said, that the issues about forgiveness, understanding, sensitivity, that they play an awfully significant part in who we become and the best of what we are. And I'm not underestimating the challenge of it, but it seems to me that these need to be some of the kind of fundamental drivers when it comes to understanding the kind of journey of adoption.
Yes.
And that relational world and what informs it.
I mean, I suppose the concern of some people sometimes is if you get birth families who might be undermining, but I don't know. Lucy, have you got some thoughts on?
Only really, there's been talk about forgiveness and empathy and understanding why things have gone wrong and what's happened in a family that's led to an adoption being necessary in the first place. And I guess I've seen a couple of messages in the chat saying, well, we should make sure children have the judgments, that they're available to adopters so that they've got information about children. And I think that's right, but it's not a complete answer to that question about finding out about people in 3 dimensions and helping children to understand why things have happened within their family. Because, yes, children have the child permanence report that's meant to stand as a record for future life story and helping children to come to terms with things. And yes, we might be able to be more reliable in making sure that judgment is available to them. But those records are all directed to justifying why it's necessary for them to be adopted and taken away from their parents. And they don't tell that rich story about the funny and wonderful things that their parents might have done quite separately from failing them as parents. So that other aspect, not the things that crossed thresholds or meant that nothing else would do, but the other side of families, the information that Amanda was giving, are not going to be found in those documents.
Thank you very much. Well, we're nearly getting towards the end. Can I just ask you one more short question of all 3 of you? Well, it's a short question, could lead to quite a long answer, but if there was one thing you had to change to the process, what would it be? Amanda?
Put adopted adults at the forefront of everything, on adoption leadership boards, on reform, on television, on Twitter, at conference. It's absolutely astounding and unforgivable that all of these things, all of those reports, or that adopted people themselves you have to scrabble about to find them, and that's shocking. And I think that in itself makes adopted people feel really bad.
Thank you. Very interesting. And John?
There's a specific term that's come up from Josh McAllister and the Independent Childcare Review, experts by experience. And I guess that was the point that really you were making, that there's so much to be learned, and where leadership needs to be kind of driven by those that have direct experience. And I do like that term, experts by experience. And I think, Amanda, that was a part of what I heard you saying then, that making contact with and coming to understand and exploring what people actually tell us as a result of direct experience is a pretty key part of something which is actually missing at the moment.
Thank you very much. And Lucy?
Well, I agree with what Amanda says about adopted adults being at the front of things, but I suppose to add something of my own, I think that better information for adopters. I've represented a number of prospective adopters, and the one thing that really shines through is that it's been so much more challenging than they ever thought it would be. They are superbly committed and amazing support for the children that they have been looking after, but it's been so much more complex than they ever expected it to be. And I think that helping them to appreciate that before they take the plunge, helping them to think through the complexities of contact, and that actually there might be some advantages to that, albeit that it's tricky, would be really useful in terms of making sure that matches are well made and placements sustain.
Well, thank you all very much indeed. And at 29 minutes past 6, it's time I think, to draw this wonderful event to a close, I really do want to say thank you on behalf of everybody to our brilliant speakers. Really, it was absolutely fascinating what each of you said, and thank you for all your answers to the questions as well. I know a lot of hard work goes into preparing for evenings like this. We're very, very fortunate to have such a range of expertise to inform us. I also want to thank the FJC for their work in putting on this event and the series of events this week, which are all going to be extremely interesting. Paula Adshead and Daphne Wilson have done a huge amount of work, so has Jenny Beck and Maria Kavanagh. I know people have been working around the clock to make this a really good event, and it has been. So thank you all very much indeed for your questions. The chat bar's been very busy all evening, and that's wonderful too. So thank you all very much, and I hope we'll see you tomorrow as well. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.